Well, for those people in the United States, happy 4th of July, Independence Day. For all Buddhists, happy Interdependence Day. And good morning for those where there is sunshine, and good evening to those who are where it is getting dark, where it is also winter, or also on the other side of the globe. Today, I'm going to begin by starting at the ending of the Buddha. And that is recorded in a sutta known as the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And that could be translated as the Sutra of the Great Passing. It's in the long discourses, the Digha Nikaya of the Pali collection. And we read this: "And the Blessed One said to Ananda, it may be that you think the teacher's instruction has ceased. Now we have no teacher. It should not be like this, Ananda, for what I have taught and explained to you, as the Dhamma and discipline will, at my passing, be your teacher." However, the Buddhist community has often been split by a dispute that has recurred throughout its history. This wound in the body of Buddhism was and still remains a debate over whether study of the teachings, Gantadhara and Pali, should have priority over practice, Vipassanadhara in Pali. At first glance, this debate seems absurd, for the Buddhists know that realization is non-conceptual and found in practice. However, at second glance, this disagreement raises some interesting questions. What is the relationship of the sutras to the other teachings in practice? To what extent does a practitioner have to know theory? How much should Buddhism go by the book? How should we relate text and practice to each other? On the one hand, there is the well-established linear pattern of study, pariyatti, leading to practice, patipatti, issuing and realization, pativeda. And this is, to a significant degree, the pattern many Buddhists follow. Furthermore, it receives support from certain sections of the various Pali Sutras. For example, the linear sequence of the Eightfold Path near the end of the Sutra of the Great 40, Mahachattarisaka Sutta, in the middle-length discourses, Majjhima Nikaya. In a linear view, the way is seen as a ladder, with the devotee ascending one rung at a time. Following this linear logic, the scholar monks of the Mahavihara monastery in Anuradhapura, the ancient capital of Sri Lanka, succeeded in establishing their primacy over the practice monks in the 1st century before the Common Era. This major turning point in Theravada history has served Buddhism well, in that it led to the careful preservation of the ancient texts, which might have been radically altered or even lost had not such devotion to scripture taken hold. However, a very high price was paid. The Sri Lanka Theravada meditation tradition became feeble and eventually almost disappeared from the island. Fortunately, it was transplanted to mainland Southeast Asia, where it flourished as the forest tradition, and from which it has been reintroduced into Sri Lanka. This is the danger of such a one-sided, simply bookish approach to the Dharma. It can smother and even kill the living reality of the Dharma by reducing it to ideas only, a pedantic exercise, which is a violation of the Buddha's intent, not to mention the Buddha's words. There are other dangers as well. For instance, ignoring the reality of one's meditation experience by trying to conform it to an interpretation in selected terms in a sutra. This is the cookbook approach. Here we must remember that Buddha's own approach to language. Words are mere conventions used in a context to symbolize meanings. Words have no ultimacy, but they are strictly relative. They do not have a reifiable reality. Therefore, the Buddha's discourses, as the late Professor Kalapahana says, quote, turned out to be rather flexible. The discourse, as well as its contents, were pragmatic in nature, unquote. Living practice and realization cannot be restricted to the concepts of books. The texts are guidelines, not dogmatic writ. They are fingers pointing to the moon. The translator, Thomas Cleary, puts it this way, quote, we must remember that scriptures in Buddhism are not intended to present doctrine to be accepted or rejected as dogma, but have as an important function the provocation of thought and reflection. Yet, there are also dangers in ignoring the texts. Without their counsel, practice can veer wildly from the way. For instance, both ancient and modern Buddhism have included many such cases of self-serving antinomian behavior and disguised soul theories, promulgated by meditators who have disdained reading the sutras and other important texts. Both the Theravada forest tradition and the Zen mountain tradition have produced an abundance of such teachers. Daido Roshi of Zen Mountain Monastery called this ersatz Zen Buji Zen. Such distortions and abuses raise the question as to whether the ancient study-practice dispute is even valid. In other words, must Buddhism divide into scholars and practitioners? The short answer is no. First, if we look closely at the articulations of the way in the sutras, we can see that it can be understood in an equally valid nonlinear way. The first part of the above-mentioned Sutta of the Great 40 testifies to this. All factors of the way are interrelated and support each other. In this vision, the way can be perhaps seen or imagined as a spiral, an ascending spiral, a circle of interconnected parts. In this more holistic vision, study as an elaboration of preliminary right view need not always precede practice. In fact, many Western Buddhists came to the Dharma by way of practice, not by way of study. Furthermore, our modern study has some similarity to the Buddha's disciples listening to his discourses. Additional insight comes from East Asia. The practice-study rift also occurred in China and Korea, where it was known as the Meditation Sutra debate. This fissure was once healed through the insight of one of Korea's greatest masters, Chinul, who lived from 1158 to 1210. Following the lead of Tsungmi, 780 to 841 in China, Chinul called the sutras the Buddha's words and meditation the Buddha's mind. This unification of study and practice was confirmed by Chinul's own practice, wherein he would experience a penetrating insight while reading a line of text soon after having completed a period of intensive meditation. The text provided Chinul with a breakthrough prompt for which his intensive meditation had prepared him. The result was profound realization. Furthermore, Chinul's practice realization gave him deeper insight into the meaning of the text. In short, Chinul saw that study is not distorted into an excuse to avoid practice or to indulge in dry intellectualism, but is part of the deeper understanding of the unitary practice realization. The sutras and meditation are dynamically and dialectically interrelated in practice realization. More accurately, they interpenetrate each other. While the East Asian tradition has involved considerable dispute about sudden and gradual practice and realization, especially as based on the distinctive Zen tenet of ancestral faith and the Huayan exegesis on the interpenetration of all aspects of the way, that debate does not negate Chenul's essential point. What is important is that Chenul and other East Asian teachers have made it clear that the way is integral in all aspects, and to segregate it into exclusive, isolated study and practice segments is to distort it. The division of the Dharma into isolated meditation and study camps results from a partisan understanding, the kind of disputation the Buddha severely criticized in the Sutta Nipata and the discourse on the simile of the snake in the middle-length saying Discourses of the Buddha, where he says, quote, "Here, bhikkhus, some misguided men learn the Dhamma, the discourses, stanzas, expositions, verses, explanations, sayings, birth stories, marvels, and answers to questions. But having learned the Dhamma, they do not examine the meaning of those teachings with wisdom. Not examining the meaning of those teachings with wisdom, they do not gain a reflective acceptance of them. Instead, they learn the Dhamma only for the sake of criticizing others and for winning it in debate. And they do not experience the good for the sake of which they learned the Dharma. Those teachings, being wrongly grasped by them, conduce to their harm and suffering for a long time. Suppose a man needing a snake, seeking a snake, wandering in search of a snake, saw a large snake and grasped its coils or its tail. It would turn back on him and bite his hand or arm or one of his limbs, and because of that he would come to death or deadly suffering. So too, here some misguided men learn the Dharma, but having learned the Dharma, they do not examine the meaning of those teachings with wisdom. Not examining the meaning of those teachings with wisdom, they do not gain a reflective acceptance of them. Instead, they learn the Dharma only for the sake of criticizing others and for winning in debates. They do not experience the good for the sake of which they learned the Dharma. Those teachings, being wrongly grasped by them, conducive to their harm and suffering for a long time. Here, bhikkhus, some men learn the Dharma, and having learned the Dharma, they examine the meaning of those teachings with wisdom. Examining the meaning of those teachings with wisdom, they gain a reflective acceptance of them. They do not learn the Dharma for the sake of criticizing others and for winning in debates. And they experience the good for the sake of which they learned the Dharma. Those teachings, being rightly grasped by them, conduce to their welfare and happiness for a long time. Suppose a man needing a snake, seeking a snake, wandering in search of a snake, saw a large snake and caught it rightly by the neck. Then, although the snake might wrap its coils around his hand and his arm or his limb, still he would not come to death or deadly suffering because of that. Why is that? Because of his right grasp. So too, some men learn the Dharma, and having learned the Dharma, they examine the meaning of those teachings with wisdom. Examining the meaning of those teachings with wisdom, they gain a reflective acceptance of them. They do not learn the Dharma for the sake of criticizing others and for winning in debates, and they experience the good for the sake of which they learned the Dharma. Those teachings, being rightly grasped by them, conduce to their welfare and happiness for a long time. End quote. In this sutra, the Buddha next compares the Dharma to a raft, which is, quote, for the purpose of crossing over, not for the purpose of grasping, unquote. So sutra study is dialectically interrelated to meditation in the process of unitary practice realization. It is a matter of dynamic balance and harmony. The Buddha's mind and the Buddha's words are not separate. Sutra study is part of practice. When it comes to the Buddhist sutras to study, one of the first things students notice is the vastness of Buddhist sutras, the vastness of the canons, in several different scriptural canons. This is radically different from the Abrahamic faiths of Christianity with its Bible, Islam with its Quran, and Judaism with its Tanakh and Torah. Not only are the Buddhist canons vast, they are quite diverse. Not only are they quite diverse, but some of them have been open and some still seem to be open, meaning not closed off to new additions. I tried to capture the size and diversity of the Buddhist canons in the chart handout, which is unfortunately rather simplistic. Let's look at it. So you've got handouts, and I believe you've got this one, which is a chart. And if you look at the chart, you'll see across the top, Theravada, that's one canon set. Then Tibetan and East Asia Mahayana, the Vaipulya Sutras, enlarged or expanded sutras. And then a little bit on the side, Zen. Zen is part of Mahayana, but that tradition has some separate editions that you don't find in the rest of the Mahayana. So you'll see that the structure of the sutras is very, very, very different. There are vast numbers of sutra. If you look under general structure, you'll see that the Theravada Sutra has 5 collections. We'll take a look at those. And then the Mahayana canon in the East Asian version has a family of sutras. For example, the Prajnaparamita. I just used 3 different examples up here. There are many, many. The Dharma Pundarika has a certain number of chapters. That's a separate sutra, the Lotus Sutra. And then you have the Avatamsaka Sutra, Huayan, which is a whopping thing. It's really not a single sutra. It's more of a collection of sutras like a Nikaya. You find that the settings differ. If you look here, you'll see it's the main setting that the Theravada Sutra is largely endeavors to be historically based in the Gangetic valleys in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. There's little setting in the Prajnaparamita, which is an important point, and it's more archetypal, cosmic. You find the same thing with the Siddharma Pundarika. And then if there's we have the Avatamsaka Sutra. Has anybody here read the Avatamsaka Sutra? Anybody? Okay, well, you're all muted. Well, it's mind-blowing. It's quite a trip. And I call it hyperbolic, archetypal, interpenetrating cosmic spiritual worlds. It is really an extraordinary work. Mind-blowing repetition. And then we have, of course, the Platform Sutra, or the Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, which again endeavors to have some historicity. You have different personalities. Then if you look at the rest of this particular chart, you'll see that there is a different style of discourse and that there are some distinctive teachings and they vary in the contemporary status. It's all an extraordinary phenomenon that you don't find in the Western faiths. It is an amazing phenomenon, which has a lot to do with the flexibility of the Buddha in his original teachings. Well, having taken a look at that handout, the chart, let's look at the Pali Nikaya Sutras first. And later we'll look at the most popular, most chanted Mahayana Sutra, the wonderfully concise Mahayana Heart Sutra, the Heart of Perfect Wisdom Sutra, which is something that I recite every day. As many of you know, the Theravada canon, called the Tipitaka, is divided into three parts. The Sutta Pitaka, comprised of discourses, the Vinaya Pitaka, devoted to monastic rules, and the Abhidhamma Pitaka, systematizing the Dharma in abstract language. Let's look at the Sutta Pitaka. The Sutta Pitaka is divided into 5 groups, each with its own character. I'll follow the analysis of the late Samanera Bodhisattva. Now, back in the beginning of Buddhism, the sutras were memorized and transmitted by groups of redactors, people who memorized and basically edited each group. Each group was devoted to a specific collection. Each group of monks had its own core of favorite sutras. Some of these discourses would be derived from talks by the company's own teacher or stories of local monastic history. However, others would be drawn from a common stock of stories. We would also expect that they would choose largely not only discourses from whose subject matter appealed to them, but also the type of discourse that appealed to them, because the discourses vary in type. Therefore, some groups would learn brief and pithy sayings, while others would prefer discourses that develop their subject matter in detail. Still others would prefer a good narrative. For example, some monks would gravitate towards texts in which the subject matter was intertwined with character and event, resulting in a story form. This sort of text would have particularly appealed to monks living near villages or towns. So it is that the collection of discourses which are long, called long discourses, Digha Nikaya, does, in fact, address itself to matters of concern to the laity far more frequently than any other collection. Indeed, nearly half discourses in this collection are addressed to lay people, and in most others, lay folk play a significant role. That is a characteristic of that particular collection. And as you know, Bhikkhu Bodhi has translated these, although this one is done by Walsh, so this one has much more laity in it than the others. Some monks, in contrast, gravitate I did that. Life in the forest is not as easy as life near a town. Aside from time devoted to meditation, there are many time-consuming chores in the forest monastery life. Forest monks would have less time for the learning of long discourses and perhaps less inclination. Not only are forest monks often more given to meditation than are village monks, they are also less frequently visited by lay people, and therefore have less need to accommodate lay interests. Many of them, however, would wish to know discourses which dealt instructively in detail with a subject. They would learn sutras of moderate length, and they would choose subject matter in accordance with the interests they are pursuing. Hence, there is a collection of discourses which are of middle length, the middle length discourses, Majjhima Nikaya, rich in variety of subject matter, but of less immediate relevance to the concerns of laity. than the longer discourses, and in which the laity play a much smaller role. And less than a quarter of these talks are addressed to the lay people. Naturally, many teachers taught by way of a particular subject, such as the practice of reflection regarding the sense faculties, or the five aggregates, or feelings. Hence, there tended to coalesce, with no planning necessary, collections of discourses grouped according to subject matter. And today, these exist as the connected discourses, discourses connected by subject matter, the Samyutta Nikaya. We see that the Buddha's teaching is much given to enumeration. 3 kinds of feeling, 4 right efforts, 5 powers, 6 senses, 8-fold path, 4 truths. This may be regarded as a device to serve both mnemonic and pedagogical purposes. It would be expected then that some monks would avail themselves of this numerical device, which is an Indian literary style also found in non-Buddhist texts. And so they would learn discourses according to the number of items discussed. Therefore, today there exists a collection of discourses arranged numerically up to 11. The numerical discourses, or the Anguttara Nikaya. Finally, there were other sutras, poetry, and other subject matter that didn't fit these 4 collections. So they were grouped in the Khuddaka Nikaya, the catch-all collection, the and so forth collection. Famous texts in this group are the Therigatha, that is the poetry of the nuns, the Therigatha, the poetry of the monks, the Dhammapada, the way of the Dharma, Sutta Nipata, the Udana, and Itivuttaka. These are small books. For example, the Sutta Nipata is very small, although Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation is massive because he includes commentaries. The Udana is really kind of small. People knowledgeable about sutras, like Bhikkhu Bodhi, recommend that students start with the middle-length sayings or the long discourses because of their narrative form. They usually have a structure that is on your handouts and that they follow a particular pattern. They've got characters in them. They actually have some humor here and there, and therefore they're much more inviting than going through the numerical discourses or the connected discourses. Look at the handout that you've got called Typical Sutta Structure. So another one of the handouts you've got has the typical sutta structure on it. Although I can't, okay, how to read the sutras. Typical sutra structure, it looks like this. And you'll find, this is prepared by Bodhisattva, and you'll find here that the sutra usually follows this path. It is a very, very familiar one, applicable especially to the middle-length sayings and the long discourses. It is good to keep this in mind. I've lost, okay, it is good to keep this in mind. I've lost a page. Hold on. Okay. Good to keep this in mind when you're studying or reading these 2 collections. Okay, if you take a look at Bodhisattva's handout, do you have any questions about it? It shows at the beginning, thus have I heard, which is Bhikkhu Ananda, where the teaching took place, Kosambe and Nathapindika's park, something like that. an introduction to who was concerned and the other relevant information, and then a concise statement of the theme, in which then, of course, each aspect is brought forward, repeated, and developed. Similes are used. Similes are the Buddha's most common method of teaching. Then this is dealt with in various ways. The opening theme reproduced, and the concluding remarks, usually of approval, praise, and pleasure. This is the standard style. Now look at another handout that I sent you called On Studying the Sutras. It looks like this. You should have that. And this is from former Kantipalo, now deceased. At the time he did this, he was a monk. He left the robe later. And notice what it says. He says at the top here, when we have taken note of who is being addressed in a sutta, what do we look for next? Since it is the Dharma that one is reading, one should read on with the thought of what relevance does this have for me? The Dhamma must not be just another intellectual interest because it is meant to change one's character. Lead one to see and how dukkha may be transcended. The sutta should therefore be read thinking, what can I practice here? And he makes 2 points that when you're reading this sutta, you should read it out loud. The sutras are oral literature. And one thing is when you do read them out loud, as he says below, their repetition may hammer home certain truths which the defiled mind is loath to accept. It helps you remember them. And sometimes you can kind of get a rhythm to the repetitious pattern, and of course make notes. And notes taken of one's understanding or questions or especially striking passages. At any rate, you should not try reading the sutras in the way you read novels. Because if you do that, as he notes, they will not sink in. If you read them as novels, you're probably not going to continue to read them because that is not the style. It's a radically different style than modern Western or even ancient Japanese novels. Okay, then from Bhikkhu Nyanamoli, he says, the style of the sutras have an economic simplicity coupled with the richness of idioms that makes it very polished vehicle hard to do justice to in translation. That is the main problem, but there's also another, the special feature of the repeated verbatim passages, sentences and phrases which occur again and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. This peculiarity is probably due to the original fact these books were intended for recitation. We have in Europe, we are used to formal repetitions of symphonic music in the concert hall, and even to refrains in poetry, but in prose we find it very strange. So there's a cultural distinction here. To the reader unused to them, these repetitions, in the extent to which they appear in Pali, seem disagreeable on a printed page. They have therefore, for the most part, been elided in translation by means of various devices, though always with particular regard to preservation of the original architectural form of the discourses, which is one of the notable characteristics of the utterances. At the same time, however, some repetitions have been retained, exploiting the valuable technique of discovery of the familiar. Such repeats, if verbatim in the Pali, are verbatim in English too. That's Nyanamoli, who did the original translation of the Majjhima Nikaya that Bhikkhu Bodhi then went back and smoothed out and made contributions of his own. So those are the characteristics of the Pali Suttas. Now, I also sent you 2 suttas. And these two suttas, neither of them is from the middle length sayings or the long discourses. One is from the Udana, and that is the Bahaya Sutra. And one is from the Samyutta Nikaya, and that is Khemaka. These sutras are worth taking a look at, and in them you can find some interesting information about the structure of the sutras and also some interesting Dharma things. In reading these, we want to read the sutta passage, read it out loud as suggested by Bhikkhu Kantipala, which also may be useful. So we can do these now. Do you have any questions up to this point in time? Anybody who is not muting themselves? My cat has questions.
I have one question, Michael, and actually it's for Faye or Larry. Are we going to make these recordings available? Because I would really love to watch this again.
Yes, we have a recording will be posted on the website.
Thank you.
Okay, so Jane, thank you again. Anybody else?
I have a question. This is my first retreat, so I'm not familiar with where the website is. So once it's posted, can I get a message about, the detail, the URL, please?
Can you get a message about what?
The connection, the website, the location of the file.
Yin-Shun.org.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions?
Yeah, Michael, I have a question.
Yeah.
Especially for folks who are new to Buddhist text, kind of Buddhism in general, kind of interested. Where should one start?
Well, I would go, well, there's several things you can do. One thing is, in terms of publications, one has Bhikkhu Bodhi's books. In terms of the internet, you've got Access to Insight, which is a very good source. You also have some other groups. If you go to Access to Insight and you go to, you'll look for Befriending the Sutras by Bullitt, who was the founder of Access to Insight. That's one particular place. If you can get a hold of Bhikkhu Bodhi's lectures that are recorded. If you can play a CD, or it's not a CD, it's M3. If you have equipment that can play a disc, you can use this. My computer is a MacBook Pro. It doesn't take discs anymore. There is also, I think, for the Majjhima Nikaya, which is the group that I would start with, I would begin with the middle-length discourses. Which in books
Michael just presenting, this is a CD from the Bhikkhu Bodhi. It's also posted in the Yin-Shun.org.
Yeah, you want to get the whole collection.
Yeah, we have those on the website.
If you buy the book, this is expensive. So I would suggest going on to the internet and starting by reading them on the internet or listening to Bhikkhu Bodhi's talks. There is also on the internet something called Pressing Out, well, you can order this book. It's called Pressing Out Pure Honey. It is by Sharda Rogel. Pressing Out the Honey by Charter Rogel. And what she has done is she has gone through the Majjhima Nikaya, and she has taken each sutta, like here we have Magandhya, and she summarizes the sutta. She has notes. She has a practice point. Then she goes on to another sutta like the Sandaka Sutta, summary, notes, and again she'll have a practice point, and she does the entire Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length sayings this way. So you can combine what she does. Hold on, my cat's unhappy. You can combine this with Bhikkhu Bodhi's lectures, and that is a good way to start reading suttas, doing the two together. Yes, do you hear my cat? Anyhow, he's distressed because he's being ignored. That is one good way to start. The you can also use the translations by Thanissaro Bhikkhu if on Access to Insight. And what you get is if you take Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations, which are very excellently translated and very standard, and then you can take Thanissaro's translations, which are more experimental, trying to get a livelier, shall I say, a more modern feel to them. Then you get an excellent way to understand any particular given sutras. Also, you can try putting into your browser or your search, Befriending the Sutras. This is a very useful handout by John Bullitt, Bullitt. And he does go through much of the information that I've mentioned, and in a slightly different way. And then it's very, very helpful. And he suggests individual sutras that you can use for different topics. So those are some beginning points. Does that information help? No?
Yeah. Yeah, very useful. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions?
Michael, I have a question, please.
Well, I went a little, yeah.
Oh, at the top of the lecture, you had referenced the decline of Buddhism in Sri Lanka and the reintroduction.
Yeah.
Do you have a source for that?
There have been sources. I have a number of books on the Buddhist revival in Sri Lanka, because when I was doing a degree, I did papers on the Buddhist revival of Sri Lanka. And what I would have to do is go to another room and get those books out. But there are some books that talk about that in terms of the larger revival of Buddhism, the emergence of what we call the Protestant Buddhism form in contemporary Sri Lanka with people like Anagarika Dharmapala and all of that kind of thing. But much of that I learned when I was in Sri Lanka. Anything else? Basically, the main source for the revival of the forest tradition in Sri Lanka was Burma, not Thailand. There was influence later from Thailand, but the initial one was Burma. Burma and Sri Lanka, the Burma and Sri Lanka monastics have a stronger connection to each other than either of them do to the Thai, the Lao, or the Cambodians. So there's been a very strong influence originally from Sri Lanka to Burma, and subsequently in more recent times from Burma back to Sri Lanka. Any other questions? Okay, well, what I had planned, I went a little faster than I had intended, but what I planned was to give you some homework. And I'm going to do this. You have two other handouts that you got. One is, I mentioned earlier, the Bahia Sutra. The other one is about Khemaka, the Khemaka Sutta. The first one, as I had said before, is from the Udana. That is a small collection of verses of uplift, which is what Udana means. And the other one is from, as I said before, the Samyutta Nikaya, or the connected discourses. Hold on. There you go. Okay, treats will quiet the cat. So what I would like you to do is read one or both of these as homework, and then we can discuss them tomorrow. Now, this other handout, some suggestions for studying suttas, you can use this as a guide, and then tomorrow, before we go into the Mahayana, we can go through these two suttas. You can find what is the main idea, the topic, the theme. How do you respond to this particular sutta? What down here are there hindrances? One of these suttas would be extremely repetitive, and I imagine that will be a hindrance. So you can study these, and if you're not able to print them out, you can go online and look for about Khemaka, access to insight, and Bahia. And we can discuss these in the morning before we turn to a different category of sutras, a different collection, which is the Mahayana Sutras. So there is more information here or more time here to answer questions or discuss anything you would like.
I missed a lot of your lecture because I couldn't get on. So I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'll just read everything.
Okay.
Professor, may I ask a question? With regards to some of the sutras, for example, some of the sutras were actually translated into Chinese.
Oh, yeah.
Would you say that a lot of the Chinese sutras that we chant as a part of the Chinese Buddhism practice, would there be a majority of those sutras that retain that type of structure? You know how you talked about the Buddhist structure, about how it always has a person that the Buddha speaks to, and then the time and the place, and the constant repetitiveness of certain concepts.
Oh, yeah.
When it translates into Chinese, do they actually retain that structure? This is based on your experience of your analysis.
In some of them they did, and some of them they did not. A very interesting point has to do with the Prajnaparamita Heart Sutra. And that one, there's a lot of controversy nowadays, especially due to the work of a scholar, now deceased, Professor Jan Nattier, on the origin of the sutra. It exists in two forms. One form is the 14 line, and another form is the 25 line. The 14 line has no introduction whatsoever. It is amazingly concise. The 25 line has more lines because it includes "thus have I heard" and kind of the classic structure, which according to the scholars has been added after the original sutta. The original Heart Sutra did not have that. And then in others, you find it kind of introduced. For example, if you take the Lotus, take the Lotus Sutra and you go to the beginning of the Lotus Sutra. Let me get to the beginning here. That's 2. And here it begins. Thus have I heard, at one time the Buddha was staying at Rajagriha on the Holy Eagle Peak. That's exactly that same introduction. But the rest of it, then the Lotus Sutra goes off into its own particular way. So you do have it included sometimes in these Mahayana sutras. However, it's not every sutra. It's these sutras that have some kind of story background. If you go to the connected discourses and you go to the numerical discourses, many of them don't have the structure because they don't have a narrative. But frequently you will find that in many of the sutras that I don't know exactly which ones you're chanting, but in terms of what you read and study, you'll find that in those Mahayana sutras.
I don't have much experience with a lot of the Chinese sutras, but obviously the most common one is obviously the Amitabha Sutra that's constantly chanted amongst the Chinese Buddhists.
Mm-hmm. That one I haven't, I read part of that years ago, but I haven't read that recently, so I can't answer.
I can answer that. It does, Helen. It has that classical structure of where it was spoken, who was at the assembly. I think because you're listening to this definition of the classical sutra structure in English, you may not be able to reconcile it to the Chinese, where at the Huasang Monastery it has been taught, but in Chinese, of course. So the Amitabha Sutra that you chant definitely has it. Quite a few of the larger sutras that are quite common has it as well. But one thing you got to be clear with the Chinese canon, there are some that might have the word sutra, but they're not actually a sutra per se, as in like they're not derived from the Buddha's teachings. They're more like from another ancient master. A classical one would be the Platform Sutra. And some of them are what the Chinese call lun. So they're actually the treatises from the various masters like Nagarjuna and all the others. So those will, in those type of texts, you won't really see that classical sutra structure.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about, if you want to compare it to the Amitabha Sutra, it has that full structure. So if you think of it like an essay with an intro, body, and a conclusion, with the sutra, you always have, thus have I heard. It generally starts with that line from Ananda. Where was it given? Who was in the assembly? Who was the main audience in terms of who did the Buddha talk to? And it was always, Sariputra, blah, 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 or Subhuti, blah, 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 blah. And after that first introduction, it'll be like almost like a dialogue between the Buddha and that main person in the audience. And you get that in the Amitabha Sutra. When you're chanting it, you just have to remember how many times do you have to read out Sariputra, Sariputra, Sariputra. It just keeps popping up. And that's actually because Buddha is actually telling Sariputra, the Buddha's land is this, this. Sariputra, the Buddha's such and such and such. And then at the very end of that particular sutra, you have the classical conclusion, which is, after this has been given, all the gods, all the devas, etc., received it with joy and rapture and that usual final section. But a lot of the larger Chinese sutras have that classical.
Then again,
okay, thank you.
I'm holding the 8,000 line Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, the translation by Kanze, and which is considered by some scholars consider this the earliest of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And it's missing. It's entirely missing in this one. It starts with thereupon the Lord, in order to gladden the four assemblies and to further enlighten the perfection of wisdom, preached at that time the following verses, and it goes right into it. That has, I think, a lot to do with how these sutras developed. And the perfection of wisdom is radically different from the lotus. These two kinds of sutras are radically, radically different. The lotus has stories in it and parables, famous parables. You don't get that so much in the perfection of wisdom sutras. But that was the original classical structure, and you will find that in the two sutras I've given you, Bahya Sutra, thus have I heard at one time, yada yada Savati Jata Wood and at the Pindika's monastery. And in the other one, the Kosambi Sutra, the Khemika Sutra, at one time many elder monks were staying near Kosambi and Goshicha's monastery, and you follow that particular structure. So it does seem to be common also as well in many Mahayana sutras. Any other questions? Did anything I say make sense?
Yes, I like that.
I'll just have to guess because I can understand what I'm reading anyway. So
yeah. Anyhow, do read these two sutras. I chose these two sutras. Number one, be quite honest, it was a subjective element. I happen to like these two sutras, so I chose them. Number one, I like them, but number two, they're short. And I think each of them may make a useful point in terms of subject matter. And I hope you enjoy reading them either in the handout that I've sent you or if you want to go online to Access to Insight. Access to Insight will give you several translations. For example, the Bahya Sutra, the one I have here, is by John Ireland, and he's from his translation of the Udana, and he has, they also, in Access to Insight, have another one by Thanissaro Bhikkhu. And in terms of Khemika, you have two translations by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, his earlier translation and his later translation, his revised translation. So you can get a lot of stuff. We're very fortunate to have the internet now, because with the internet, we can have sources that we never had before. And just as we can reach each other across continents and oceans for this retreat, which we could never do before. So it's a great, great boon.
Yeah, I read this two sutras briefly. It is very interesting. A lot of what you say, a lot of repetition. So when we read it out loud, it's really sink into your mind.
Yeah.
Keep repeating 3, 4, 5 times some of those sentences.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very good.
Yeah, as mentioned, you can not only hammers in the point being made, but it has a certain rhythm. And Bhikkhu Bodhi, Piyadasi Thera, other Jnana Punika, other monks I have known or know who are experts in Theravada Sutras also talk about that this has a beauty in Pali. When one of these sutras would be chanted in Pali or recited in Pali, that refrain, like music, as Jnanamoli mentions, like music, it has a certain beauty to it because it is exactly like a musical refrain. And that it was pleasing to the ear for those people who would hear these things being recited and chanted.
I also like to suggest or share my experience. At the beginning, when I read the sutta, I saw all this repetition. I just skip it. Now I realize you cannot skip any one of them. Otherwise, you forget after you finish the whole sutra.
Yeah.
So you need to repeating continuously, attentively, not just like a novel, like what Professor Roehm just said. Not reading like a novel. Some people are reading in the bed. I don't think that's a good idea. You have to sit down and respect the sutta when you're reading it. This is Buddha
I also think it's important. I think of it a very radically different sutta, the Avatamsaka, or the Garland Sutra, which is this enormous text that is a Mahayana text. It not only repeats, but it uses vast quantities of numbers, and it's almost as though it's psychologically trying to reframe your mind by repetition and by the increased numbers, things that kind of stretch the mind from its ordinary patterns of thinking. So it's important to read it and not skip over it.
And also not to put your biased thinking while you're reading it. That's what I mean attentively. Try to absorb what they say, what they are repeating for. That's very helpful to understand the content, the teachings.
Well, I also think it's very important down here on this handout, some suggestions for studying the sutras. It says, recognize your hindrances. That is, does something interfere with your full appreciation of the passage? Does something annoy or irritate you? Write it down. Investigate it in a book or with a monk, teacher, or Dharma friend. Grapple with it. Remember that the Buddha delivered his timeless Dharma 2,500 years ago in the Gangetic Plain, a very different place and time from us. So sometimes we need to work with that to find out what is it in us that is annoyed. Why are we annoyed? That is some self-discovery.
I think the most obvious is the internet not working.
Yes, very contemporary. I think Larry's about ready to ring the chime.
Well, whenever you're ready, Professor. So.
Okay, if there are any more questions, we can do that. Otherwise, we can meet again tonight.
We have plenty of time this morning, except the Australian.
Oh yeah, it's nighttime there. It's time to get a good night's sleep.
It's 11:30 now.
Go to bed. We have you to listen to tomorrow, so you need to be refreshed. So does anybody here actually read sutras?
I do.
I'm still working my way through the anthology in the Buddha's words.
Ah, yes. How do you like that?
It's a pretty good selection. And actually, Bhikkhu Bodhi has all his recordings of his Dharma talks on each section online. So I can put that in the chat if you want.
Mm-hmm. Well,
that book Bhikkhu Bodhi was giving lecture with, so it is recorded. So it's very good with the book in front of you to listen.
Yeah, and now he's doing the Anguttara Nikaya, I understand.
And on the Bodhi Monastery website, I think the Majjhima Nikaya lectures are on there too. So
they're really good.
I just listen. I read them over and over again, or I listen to them over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And Venerable Bodhi is teaching on the Anguttara Nikaya at 10 o'clock today.
So how does one connect with that? Go to Bao's website?
Yes.
Join the Zoom.
I think it's on YouTube too.
At least the past ones are on YouTube. I know that.
Yeah, later on will be on YouTube, but now it's a Zoom. It says if you follow his physical lecture, or current lecture will be 10 o'clock by Zoom.
Okay, then I think we can wrap it up.
Thank you, Michael. That was great.